I'm Diane Blazik. I'm the Executive Director of National Garden Bureau, as well as All America Selections. I have with me Gail Pabst, who is running everything behind the scenes and making sure that it goes smoothly. She will be operating our chat, and she will be posting some links there. So that's awesome. Any questions are very, very welcome, and please put those in the chat. And with that, I want to introduce our two expert panelists and let them tell you a little bit more about themselves. Let's see here. We're going to start on my screen. Laura is on top. So Laura Robles from Walters Gardens and Zoltan Kovacs from Doom and Orange. So Laura, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, like Diane said, my name is Laura Robles. I've been with Walters Gardens for about 4.5 years, and I'm a regional product manager in the Mid-Atlantic states. So while I live in Michigan, I get to travel over to the East Coast and visit our customers and talk about our perennials with our grower customers and retail customers on that side of the country.
Awesome. And Zoltan.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Zoltan Kovacs. I'm the perennial product manager for North America and Canada at Doom. I grow perennials about 27 years, started retail, growing for large retailers, small retailers. So I did pretty much everything with perennials, and I really enjoy giving webinars and talk about shade perennials because it's a lot more challenging than sun, and it's a lot more elegant gardens than sun gardens to me.
Awesome. I love that you say they're elegant. And hopefully I found an elegant picture or two for our presentation. So I thought we would start by showing some tantalizing pictures of varieties. So Laura and Zoltan both sent me some of their favorites. So I thought we would start with that and go over, I don't know, what do we have, like 20 or 30, probably about 30 different varieties. And Zoltan, I think yours are first. I bet with Z as a first name, you don't get to go first very often. So we're going to let you go first on the presentation, and you just tell me when you're ready for me to go to the next slide. But here you go. You can start with this one.
Thank you, Diane. Yeah, I would like to talk about some new Ajugas, and it's a pretty new breeding on the market. We're just introducing these varieties from actually a third-party partner, not our own, but they are very fascinating. As you know, Ajuga is a great shade plant. So if you look at the consumer value of Ajuga, it's one of the few plants flower extremely nice in the shade and tolerates a lot of cold, zone 4 hardy. Some of them even go down to zone 3, like older Reptans varieties. And not only gives you a really good foliage color, it also gives you a really good early spring color. They flower generally early spring to mid-spring, and either blue, purple flowers, some of them pink, and maybe some white ones as well. The most important one is the foliage. So these are all new varieties. One is called Ajuga Princess Elsa. It's a beautiful white and like a frosty variegated foliage with a purple flower. Can we please go to the next slide, Diane? Then we have Princess Elsa. That's actually 3 of them in the Princess series. This is Princess Leia. This is more of a white variegation with the dark green and lighter green. So it's very, very interesting foliage, and the foliage color looks really good early spring. It has like a tinge of pink sometimes and different colors on the foliage. Also, again, is like a purple blue flowering Ajuga, and it's phenomenal. It brightens up the shade. What I like about these new foliage Ajugas, it's not only foliage, obviously, flowering is really nice too. It brightens up the shade. Your shade is already pretty dark, and you need plants with, brightens up that really nice shady area. And these are not only with the flowering, but also the foliage color pretty much all year round. Next slide, please. And then Princess Elsa, this is probably one of my favorite plants. It's a smaller leaf variety. It's not a Reptans type. It's more of a Tenorii type with the purple flowers, but phenomenal foliage color. And the winter color is a lot of pinks and reds in the foliage. Great ground cover. So all these 3 Ajugas are fantastic ground cover items for shade. They're not very aggressive ground covers, so you don't have to worry about taking over your garden. You can use it for small city garden type of ground covers. They're very attractive on walkways. You can actually even step on them. They're not gonna die. They are pretty tough plants. And you don't have to worry about, I don't think deer eats Ajuga. That's the biggest issue in shade gardening is hostas and all that stuff. Deer loves that. I think that you're pretty safe with Ajuga. Next slide, please.
Okay, and I'm going to ask, I probably should have asked for this for the presentation. I noticed that you did mention zone, and if you guys can give some approximate sizes as you're talking about each one, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Approximate size of the plants?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so these plants, Ajuga is generally very short plants. They are like 4 to 6 inch tall, maybe a little bit taller with the flower, 4 to 6 inch, and they spread, and it depends how much area you let them spread. So the width of the plant is really determined by how much space you have and how much you want to have the plants. So they're very low growing plants. So I will mention the size of every variety as well.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. So ivies. Ivies are a little bit different because these are not new what I'm showing, but we offer a lot of a large variety of ivies because they are great ground covers. They are evergreen. And they don't flower, the flowering is very insignificant. You almost don't even notice it. So it's really grown for the foliage and it's really grown for covering large areas. Ivies are really not meant to be for small areas because they're taking over the garden very quickly. And, it's very hard to control ivies. Even with landscape edging, sometimes you have issues. You have to elevate the landscape edging to 3 inches to, control them. But they're also very tough plants. You can cut them any way you want them. They will come back, and hard to kill plants. Most of them are very hardy, but some of them are borderline hardy. This is needlepoint. This is more of a small leaf evergreen one. Great ground covers overall. Next slide, please. Then we have Glacier and Thorndale, more of a variegated one, variegated types, and some of them has more veining. So these are larger leaf ivies. These are a little bit slower on the ground, so these are not as aggressive. As more variegation, the foliage has basically the plant slows down because less green in the foliage. So these are very attractive also as a shade ground cover. It really brightens up the shade, and I just love them for large areas because you can cover a large area and make it very attractive very quick. And because being evergreen, most of these ivies are evergreen. You don't have to worry about the looks of the garden all year round. It looks really nice. And ivy is actually pretty aggressive on the ground, so it actually controls a lot of weeds. You're not going to have a lot of weeds coming through the ivy. Another shade perennials, if you put them, you have to consistently weed. Next slide, please. And then here's some unique ones: the Marengo and yellow ripple. And these are, again, is a larger variety, especially Marengo is a very large variety, leaf variety, a lot of variegation, very bright. And yellow ripple has a beautiful yellow variegation, and it's a medium size. Again, the same thing applies for these varieties as well. Next slide, please. And then you can even use them in pots. So a lot of people mix it with perennials in pots, and you can use it as a container plant, sun or shade. And you can see that old leaves look different than the new leaves, so it always looks really interesting. If you want a large patio pot in the shade and you want to add some color, it's overhang the pot, so it's like almost like a hang basket type. You can even put them in hang baskets if you want, but you can brighten up a shady spot with a nice ivy container, for example. Not many shade perennials you can put as flowers all season long. So, ivy, because being evergreen, it's always have a bit of an interest. Next slide, please. And then Lamium, it's another category. And I'm trying to talk about not only flowering perennials and, try to mix in some new varieties. Lamium is also a very widely known perennial for shade, and it works actually on sun or shade. And it has a beautiful variegated foliage, and then either pink or purplish pink flowers, sometimes white flowers. But what's interesting is the foliage color. It's very soft. It's not an evergreen plant in every region. Some of the very cold regions, it does die back almost to the ground. It has very small gets very small leaves. But in a warmer region, I would say, by below the below Maryland or something is more evergreen, and then in the warmer areas, definitely evergreen. This can be also very aggressive sometimes, depends on the variety. So we try to bring varieties more of a mounding, spreading, having instead of very, very spreading types. So Orchid Frost and Orchid Frost Gold 2 new one. One is more of a green, white foliage, and Orchid Frost Gold is a yellow, yellow-green foliage. Very interesting. I love these plants because one thing about Lamium, they take dry shade. A lot of people do struggle with dry shade, and flowering, for example, Astilbes, which I love, they will not take dry shade. And Lamium is one of the great ground covers for dry shade. Even Ajuga I showed you, that's not a good dry shade plant, but ivies and Lamiums are fantastic dry shade plants and super tough plants. Even in the northern countries in Canada, I see them overwinter in zone 3, 4 sometimes. So very tough. They take that dry, and they mid-spring flowering. And I love the flowering, as some people don't, but I love the flowering. And then you have really beautiful foliage all season long. Next
And
slide.
can you
Yeah.
talk about so you talked about how cold it can get. Can you guys also talk about how warm it can get? Like which ones would also be good for a nice southern or western climate as well as the cold climate?
Sure. I mean, I would say Lamium can be used pretty much entire US, besides Florida. Maybe the very, very hot, I've seen them growing in Florida, but the heat and humidity gets to the plants. So they use it in Texas, which is hot and humid as well. So besides the very deep south, Lamium I would not use. I would use more of a tropical ground covers. But above Florida, it's pretty much works all the way up to Canada. And the West Coast as well, definitely California and those states as well. And here's a couple of interesting one. Golden Anniversary is not a new one, but it has a beautiful gold variegation. And Purple Dragon is the flower color. Generally, the flowers are pink on Lamiums or white, and this purplish flower is really attractive with the white and green variegated foliage. But as I said, the most value I see on Lamium is dry shade, and you have a flowering plant in dry shade. Next slide, please. So I want to do some novelty ground covers also. These are not new plants. And this is called Pachysandra Silver Edge. As you know, the regular Pachysandra is very aggressive, Pachysandra terminalis. And this is more of a unique look. It has a variegation and it's a lot slower growing. So Pachysandra also can be very invasive in small areas. But Silver Edge is a lot more controlled because of the variegation. It grows a lot slower, and you can control them a lot easier. But it's a unique Pachysandra, so this is not for your big areas. And then Green Sheen is a very shiny foliage. So general terminalis it's not really shiny. It's pretty dull green color, and Green Sheen is just a very, very shiny foliage, also a lot slower than regular terminalis. And Pachysandra is good from a deep shade all the way till dry shade, wet shade. Pachysandra is really a multiple application plant. It's easy really to cover big areas. And if you do these varieties, maybe it's better for smaller areas that have Green Sheen and Silver Edge. Next slide, please. And then something, a very interesting plant I want to talk about, woodland phlox. It's our breeding. It's actually, what's important is it flowers right after the regular phlox in the garden, the subulata phlox called creeping phlox flowers in the garden. But this can take part shade. It's not a full shade plant. It needs to have at least 4 hours of sun, I would say, but with 4 hours, four or more hours, it will do very well. And it is a very hardy variety. It actually needs the cold. So it doesn't work in deep south, but Alabama north works pretty much in Canada as well. It overwinters even in northern Canada. So, but it does need the cold nights to flower really nicely. It's a semi-evergreen, and it does flower for a very long time. You have good 8 to 10 weeks of flowering in the spring, early spring, all the way till like early summer. Those called Phlox Woodlander series. And we will have new colors, purples and blues as well, but phenomenal plants. And these are not too aggressive, so it's more of a mounding plant. And a lot of woodland phlox is very aggressive as well, but these are bred to be more of a mounding, spreading type, so you can control them very nicely and easily.
Okay. Thank you so much, Zoltan. And so now, Laura, I think you have about a dozen or so plants that you can talk about. So we look forward to hearing from you, and just tell me when you need me to go to the next slide.
Okay, sounds good. Hopefully there's not too much background noise because there's for some reason a bunch of cheering going on out in the office. The first one that I wanted to talk about with you is a plant called Aralia. This is a variety called Sun King. And this is probably a little bit lesser known plant for shade. It can actually be used anywhere from shade to full sun. But in the shade, you get this really nice kind of chartreuse color. And as you get more sun, you get more of a gold look to this plant. And it really is quite a shrubby look to it. It gets very large, up to about 4.5 feet tall and wide under ideal growing conditions. But then in the northern regions, like Michigan is, it dies back fully to the ground every year. So the hardiness zones on these are actually quite wide. It goes from all the way from zone 3 to 9. So you would think it looks very tropical and wouldn't be hardy, but it actually is a quite hardy plant. Just a beautiful accent plant in the shade, really brightens it up, and makes kind of a nice backdrop for all of your other shade and woodland garden plants. And this plant will get a flower, but it's really insignificant. It's really about the foliage. Next slide, please. So the next one I wanted to talk about is Aruncus. So Aruncus, the common name is goat's beard. This particular variety on the screen is called Chantilly Lace, and it is one that is in the Proven Winners program. It's a little bit more compact stature than some of the species Aruncus that you might see in woodland gardens. Very, very dense, prolific flowering, but all of the Aruncus are fabulous with this very fine texture and very fine textured kind of wispy flowers. And then when the flowers are just starting to set right now in Michigan, so they're not open yet, but the buds are there. And then once they quit flowering, they're still very attractive. They kind of turn a little bit more beige, kind of a dried flower look to them, but they're still very attractive to just leave on in the garden, even after they're done actually flowering. And this is another one that is fairly hardy, all the way from around zone 4 to 9. And this particular variety gets about 16 to 18 inches tall at maturity. Next, please. So the next genus that I wanted to talk about is a stilbe, and this is actually a little bit of a sneak peek for what you can expect to see in the stores. This is a brand new variety that we're just introducing this year. So there are a few retail stores that have this already this year, because we did do kind of a pre-release for some of our growers. But this is a variety called Dark Side of the Moon that has this gorgeous, really dark foliage. It first emerges kind of a little bit more of a chartreuse tinge to it. And then as the foliage opens up and matures and gets that full sun, it turns into this nice kind of glossy jet black foliage. And then as you can see in kind of the subset picture there, it does have a nice purpley plume type of flower. Like Zoltan was mentioning before, though, this is one where you definitely want to make sure that the moisture requirement is there. A stilbe without enough moisture will get very crispy edges, and they do not recover from that the same season. So once they get to that dry point where they become crispy, you're going to have a very unsightly plant for the rest of the growing season. This is a plant that will do very well in quite a bit of shade, but will actually also do well in a fair amount of sun in more northern regions, given that it does get full of moisture. So here in Michigan, we can grow it out in full sun as long as it stays adequately wet, but also a great shade plant.
Okay, Laura, I'm going to go backwards because somebody wants to know what this plant is in front here.
Oh, those are actually little dianthus. So that is an image that was taken in the shade part of our garden here at Walters before it was redone. This is a little bit older picture. The garden has been redone since then. But that part of the garden, as you can see kind of in behind it, there are a bunch of pines. And so it does get a fair amount of shade, but it also still gets enough kind of partial sun for some more sun-loving plants. So those are dianthus in the foreground.
Okay, thank you. A little bonus there with that
Yeah,
slide. Okay,
exactly.
Here you go.
Okay, so the next plant that I queued up is a fern. This is a newer variety of an ethereum called crested surf. So this is another one that is in the Proven Winners program. And it is quite a bit like the Japanese painted fern that I'm sure everybody's very familiar with. Beautiful kind of tricolor foliage with the purple ribs and the shades of green and silver. But what makes this plant different than the standard pictum type Japanese painted fern are two things. One, as you can see in this kind of close-up picture, each tip of the frond is doubly crested. So you get kind of a little forked crest on the end of each frond. So ferns, of course, are already a very textural plant, very feathery looking. And this little cresting on the tips of this plant just adds that much more to the texture of it. The other thing that's different about this is that they are a lot more vigorous and more upright than the standard Japanese painted fern that a lot of people are familiar with. So where that plant grows a little bit more prostrate, kind of down along the ground, this particular variety, crested surf, grows more upright and definitely more vigorous. So this one will grow up to about 20 inches or so tall, and another one that's hardy from about zone 4 to 9. Next slide. Next one is a Brunera. So I put a couple different ones on here. Both of the varieties that I'm showing, plus a third one, are our newest breeding in Brunera. And one of the key things that we have bred into this genus is a much better withstanding of a disease called bacterial leaf spot that Brunera tends to get, especially in the summer. As the summer kind of gets hotter and more humid, with older varieties, you tend to see a lot of black spotting on the foliage. Eventually those spots kind of coalesce and like the whole leaf just kind of melts out. And the newer genetics are resistant to that, so you don't get that issue. So here is an example called Jack of Diamonds. This is a plant that gets very large. You can see the inset picture there with the hand in the picture, just showing how large these leaves do get at maturity. But then the other nice thing about it is the resistance. So the bigger picture there is shown in the fall. You can see the foliage on the ground, the leaves have already dropped from the trees, and the plants still look fantastic. So this is a large leaf plant. The full mature size of the plant is going to be up to about 2 to 2.5 feet tall and wide. They do get the little tiny blue forget-me-not style flowers in the spring. And then once those are done, that's when the leaves start to expand. So early in the spring, you get a much finer look, you get a smaller leaf, you get the really wispy blue flowers. And then once the flowers are done, what a lot of people will do is trim those flower stems off, and then more of that energy goes into the leaf and the leaves expand, and then it becomes more of a foliage look plant. But it's very nice all season long, also about 4 to 9 hardy. Next slide. So this one here is showing a different variety. This is actually a variety called Sterling Silver. So here you can see kind of its early spring look, which here in this part of Michigan, this is what these plants looked like about a couple weeks ago. And now they're pretty much winding down on their flowering already. But you can see all the small leaves and the small flowers. And then once you trim those off, then that's when the leaves expand. The Jack of Diamonds that I just showed you is an example of one that definitely has a more pronounced vein look to it. So it does have the silver, but a lot more of that green veining in it. Sterling Silver, as the leaves expand and mature, is a much more silver overlay. So you see some of that green in the plant now, but as those leaves mature, you will see much more silver on this variety. Next slide, please. So this is another one that I think is very underutilized and not as well known, but I think it's an awesome shade plant that should be used more. Epimedium. So the particular one on the screen is called Amber Queen. It's one of my favorite ones. I love the little yellow flowers. And Epimedium is a plant. When I first started in the industry, I worked at a little retail place in New York, in upstate New York. And we had Epimedium there, and it was kind of just the old species Epimediums before people really got involved with a lot of breeding work on them. And the flowers were very small. They tended to be down under the foliage a lot more. And since then, a lot of people have kind of glommed onto this plant and started breeding with it. The flowers are much larger, in excess of 1 inch in diameter on a lot of the varieties now. A lot of them are up much higher above the foliage. You can see Amber Queen, they're all up above. Some of them even stand up higher above the plant. Very nice little airy texture. They kind of look like butterflies, especially if you plant them in amongst hostas and other shade plants. They kind of dance above the foliage of the other plants. And then a lot of the varieties get some purpling and mottling on the foliage. If you can show the next slide, Diane, I have another example. So this is an even newer variety called Rigoletto that has a nice bicolor flower. And then also you can see a little bit better look at that purple mottling on the foliage. So anywhere from just some spots to some of them have almost a fully purple or burgundy look to the foliage. And then a couple nice things about epimedium is that it is deer and rabbit resistant. A lot of the foliage is a little bit more leathery. Some of it has a very serrated edge. It's just not something that deer and rabbit gravitate towards. And then the other thing about it is it's a good shade option a good drier shade option for your shade garden. So much better for shade than say a hosta is. Much better for dry conditions than a hosta. Go ahead, next one. So the next one I wanted to talk about is actually an ornamental grass that is a great shade option. This is Hakanakloa, or Japanese forest grass, or some people call it hack grass. Very beautiful ornamental grass that really does thrive nicely in shade to partial shade. Very nice kind of flowing look to it. A lot of times you'll see it planted in, kind of sweeps or masses like it is in this photo, but it's also just nice as a different little textural element spotted in amongst larger leaf things like hostas. It does tend to be a little bit slow growing. So if you use this in your garden, you just have to have some patience. It's not going to be as fast as like a hosta or some of the other plants that you're using in your shade garden. But once it gets established, they really do quite well and are just a beautiful backdrop to other shade items. So that those get probably about 1.5 to 2 feet wide by high, depending on the variety. Some are a little bit shorter, more like 16 to 20 inches. Next slide, hellebore. So hellebore is another shade perennial that is fantastic for deer and rabbit resistance. Kind of like with the epimedium, it has a very thick evergreen kind of rubbery leaf that is just not one that deer and rabbit like to eat. A unique thing about the hellebore is that it blooms very early in the season. So there's a couple different kinds. The type that is shown here on the screen is what we call an orientalis type or a hybridus type. These tend to be a little bit later in the spring, but still here in Michigan, they bloom in typically February or March. The hybridus types have a lot more different colors. So you can get pinks, you can get reds, you can get shades of really dark slate to black, white. A lot of them have spotting, maroon spotting, or different colors of spotting on the petals as well. And then the other type that is commonly known is the Lenten rose, which are more of a Niger type. They tend to be white, sometimes shades of light pink, and they bloom even earlier than the hybridus types do. But these are all quite hardy as well. Zones 3 to 8 on these. And depending on the type, again, probably about 16 to 18 inches tall for a lot of them. Same width. The Niger types tend to be just a little bit smaller in most cases than the hybridus types. And one kind of fun thing about hellebores that I've seen done before. So you can see in this picture, the flowers kind of nod a little bit. Some of them have been bred to face slightly more outwards, but you'll never find a hellebore. There's not one that I know of where the flowers face up. And so what a lot of people will do in the garden is actually put a big mirror underneath the plant if they're doing like garden tours, or if they really want to appreciate the full look of those flowers. And that way you see the plant from the side with all of the petals hanging, but then you also can see the image reflected in the mirror to show what it looks like from the underneath side. So just kind of a little fun way to use a hellebore.
Great tip, great idea.
Next is a heuchera. So obviously heuchera are a wonderful colorful foliage option for the garden, for the shade garden. A lot of them do have very nice flowers as well, depending on the variety. Some are more showy than others. Some have been bred and selected to bloom all season long from spring to fall. Some of them just have really one flush of flowers and are more about the foliage. But regardless, they're a great shade option. Beautiful different shades. They also can be used in containers very easily. These are going to be hardy from about zone 4 to 9 as well. And depending on the variety, there are series and varieties that go from very small sizes, around 6 to 10 inches high and wide, all the way up to really large, more landscape worthy heuchera that will get 2+ feet tall and wide. So just beautiful accent plants in the garden or in a container. And then closely related is the heucherella. So heucherella are actually hybrids that have been made by crossing heuchera with another native plant called tiarella. The tiarella is the foam flower, so you get much more of a flower power on this plant. They tend to have a lot more like bottle brush type flowers that are persistent or showy than the standard heuchera. They also have a more finely dissected leaf, so you can kind of see on this image where the leaves are more lobed. They have more of that veining central darker color to them. And depending on how much tiarella or how much heuchera is in the parentage, some of these are a little bit more along the lines of ground cover, not quite so clumping. They do spread a little bit more if they have more of that tiarella parentage in them. Next slide. Hosta. Obviously, we can't do a shade garden talk without talking about hosta. And I know some people struggle with deer and rabbits, but you gotta love hosta. There's so many different ones, and there's ways to work around deer and rabbits. In my garden, I have to work around rabbits. They're everywhere, and I do. I spend a lot of money on repellent, but you know what? Whatever it takes to keep my hostas looking good. So this one here is a variety called Autumn Frost. It's one that I really like. This one is in the Proven Winners program. It emerges in the spring with a very yellow margin with that nice blue center. And then as the season progresses and the temperatures warm up, that yellow actually changes to more of a cream. So you get kind of a transition in color through the season. This variety is more of like a medium class size. So it's never going to get huge. Kind of like 15 inches tall and wide is a typical size for this one. But just one beautiful example. If we go to another slide.
Can you tell us what's back behind here before we go to the next slide?
Oh yeah, that is a ligularia. That one looks to me like it's a variety called Britt Marie Crawford. So ligularia is another good shade option. I didn't put it in the presentation just because I know we're limited in time. But there are different ones that are dark foliage and green, and then they tend to get like a yellow flower to them.
Okay, now I'll let you go to the next one.
Okay, next one. So kind of the opposite extreme from the smaller and very bright foliage Autumn Frost, we go to a huge hosta. This is one called Empress Wu. You can see there just how big it is. And this is actually a good talking point for hosta because it is important to remember with hosta that it typically takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years for a hosta plant to reach its mature size. So what you may buy at a garden center that is in a small container in a 1-gallon pot or such, if you plant it in your garden, you can expect it to take anywhere from 3 to 5 years to reach that full size. And with the bigger ones, it takes longer. So Empress Wu is gonna be one that's gonna take more like at least 5 years. The other thing with hosta to keep in mind is that they are very water loving plants. So the more water you give it, and you don't want to put it in standing water, but the more consistent water and good moisture that you give it, the larger it's going to get. So that's why where you see hostas that get a regular irrigation, they're always going to be larger than their counterparts that don't get as much water. And then I think I have one more hosta slide in there. Yeah, so this is a new one that was introduced by us last year that I think is a fun plant. This is called Time in a Bottle. And the reason it's called Time in a Bottle, or part of what the name came from, is that the flower buds on this plant do not open. They stay closed. So they almost look like little bottles. They're never going to open up. They stay on the stems a little bit longer since they don't open up. But that combination of that kind of deep lavender with that chartreuse color, I think is just very beautiful. Nice rippled foliage too is really a nice contribution to the shade garden. Another plant that I wanted to talk about is called Polemonium. So this is a variety called Heaven Scent. The name references the scent of the flowers. It does have a scent to it. To me, it smells kind of like the annual Angelonia, if you're familiar with that. It has, both of them to me have kind of a grapey smell, but beautiful, very finely textured foliage, kind of feathery, almost looks like a fern, but then has these gorgeous flowers that bloom in early spring. And then this particular variety, Heaven Scent, gets a little bit of a burgundy tinge. You can kind of see that in the photo here. The burgundy tinge is typically more pronounced with both cooler weather and also if it has more sun. So depending on how much sun it's located in, more sun will contribute a little bit more of that bronzing to it. But if this is a great shade plant as well, and very hardy, 3 to 9, zones 3 to 9, and also gets, I'd say about 16 to 18 inches high in width as well. And then I think this is the last one that I had on here. This is a plant called Pulmonaria. This particular variety is called Spot On. All of the Pulmonarias have this very spotted foliage. So the green with different amounts of silver spotting or mottling. The foliage is beautiful all season long. The flowers occur in early spring. So here in Michigan, these typically start blooming around the beginning, early April, and then remain on the plant for about a month. So I've seen where they typically are in bloom for a full month. And then after that, the flowers drop off, but you still have this gorgeous speckled foliage that remains for the rest of the season. This is another plant that's good for drier shade. So not as dry as, say, epimedium and hellebores will tolerate. You will see it wilt a little bit if it gets too dry, but definitely not as much of a water hog as hostas are. And then also the foliage is kind of hairy. It's got this fine hairy covering on it, which makes it not very palatable to deer and rabbits. So this is another good option if you have critters that like to feed on your plants for a drier shade option.
Excellent. Okay, because that was going to be one of my questions for both of you. Sorry, I'm going back here because somebody asked which other hosta was here, and this is High Society in the front, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm going to take my screen down since we're finished with our slides. But while I'm doing that, I know both of you mentioned, but if you could name like maybe 2 that you think are the best for deer resistance.
Go ahead, Laura.
My top 2 for deer resistance would probably be hellebore and pulmonaria.
Okay, Zoltan, you want to throw your 2 choices in there?
You know, I like Laura's plants better for deer resistant than my plants. So I like Heconocloa. I don't see that much damage. Heconocloa is a great shade grass and very bright. Deer doesn't touch it, and Pulmonaria is definitely one of my favorite plant in the shade because it's just a beautiful plant. Yeah.
Okay. Other than that, it's a fence or keep spraying, right?
No, I think there's a lot of Laura mentioned epimediums, Pulmonaria, Ostilbe. I don't see the deer eating Ostilbe. So there's a lot of shade plants what deer does not touch. It's really the hosta ferns that deer does not touch ferns. It's really the hosta is the most deer magnet in the shade.
Yeah, hosta and heuchera. I know deer and rabbits will both touch heuchera too. So yeah, there are a lot of other options. But if you're like me and you just have to have your hostas, there's still a way to work around it. So
yeah. Okay.
And actually, Diane, just wanted to add something because I'm in Michigan, which, I don't live in Michigan. And I was at one of my good friends, Noah's Schwartz's garden. He's a hosta expert, and he has probably over 10,000 hostas in his garden. And I was visiting yesterday. There is supposedly a device out there puts out some sort of radio waves, and then the deer will not come near to the garden because it's I think something unharmful waves, but the deer doesn't like it, and the rabbits. And they also have now these spotlights, which, shines really quick. And it, basically, if the deer wants to come in the garden, it puts a spotlight on it quick, and then a deer, runs away. So there are some, options now out there for deer.
Yeah, just do a Google search and you might find something that you could use. So
I'm
that would
pretty
be
sure.
excellent. I think it's important when we're talking about shade gardening that we put some definitions here, because I know that there's, a full shade, a part shade, there's dry shade, wet shade. So can one of you or both of you kind of talk about some of the parameters there so that people can identify what kind of shade they have?
Sure. Zoltan, you want to cover this one or?
I can. Oh, thank you, Laura. Well, if you're talking about deep shade, basically deep shade when you don't get any direct sunlight on the plants. That's what they really call deep shade. When you call shade, I would say it's less than 2 hours of sun or only filtered sun. If you're talking about part shade, it's about 4 hours of filtered light or direct sunlight, but morning sun, afternoon shade. That's called either part sun or part shade. Part shade is more, I would say, really more of a 2 hour, and then part sun is more of a 4 hour. And anything over 6 hours is a part sun, 4 to 6, and then full sun is really considered 8+ hours. But everybody has a little bit of different opinion. Maybe I don't know if Laura, you have a different opinion on this, but that's how I describe it approximately.
Yeah, I think mine is very similar. We have the parameters on our website, and I think ours are, less than 4 hours is what we consider shade. Like 4 to 6 would be partial shade, and 6+ would be full sun. But yeah, very, very similar definitions to yours. And then in terms of moisture, I think the main thing to think about when you're thinking about either dry shade or, wetter shade, you really need to keep in mind what type of shade you're planting in. Are you planting next to a house or a fence that provides shade? Or are you planting in under big trees with big root systems that are taking up a lot of the moisture and blocking a lot of the moisture from falling? Those types of settings where you're planting in under trees, I would say tend to be more of what I would call dry shade. Obviously, you can irrigate and kind of counteract that to some degree. But rather than a set definition of, okay, this much moisture is dry shade versus this much, moisture added is wet shade, I think of it just more like if you're planted in under trees, that tends to be more of a dry shade setting, unless you are in a obviously more swampy type area, versus next to a building or a fence would be more of your standard moisture content.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about time of year to planting. I know a lot of people think, oh, it's springtime, so I'm going to go out and plant now. Because we did have a question from somebody, obviously more in a southern garden. They said they're already hitting the 90s. Should they be planting perennials now? And then what about planting in the fall? So maybe you guys can tackle that as a team here.
Yeah. I'll jump in on this one first. So I think it varies a little bit depending on what part of the country you live in. Here in Michigan, we can pretty much plant all season long as you're providing enough water. It'll get hot here too. It'll get up in the 90s, but not for nearly as long as in more, southern or western parts of the country. So if you're in a southern part where, maybe you're hitting those 90 to 100 degree plus days for a lot of the time, that may be a time where you would better kind of leave off planting. But absolutely, fall is a wonderful time for planting. As long as you do it early enough in the fall where roots have a little bit of time to get established before you get into those cold temperatures, that's a great time of year to plant perennials.
Any suggestions as far as how many weeks before first frost, as a general rule, would be a good time to plant in the fall?
I like to give at least like a month or so before frost. Some people will even plant as long as the ground is workable still. But I like to give them at least, 4 to 6 weeks or so to get established.
Yeah, I like foreplanting a lot because generally what happens, especially with shrubs, trees, and perennials as well, the top is not growing anymore. So actually the effort of the plant is really going into rooting. And, I'm not worried about usually the first small frost, like, 32, 33 degree, because it's only like a surface frost and the ground is still warm and the plants are putting out roots. But I agree with Laura. I like to be a little bit safer, at least 4 weeks before heavy frost comes in. And yeah, it's a great time to plant. I have a little bit of experience in the South because I lived there. Yeah, if you're talking about like really deep South, like Florida South, I would say, June and July and August is really not a good time to plant, because not only the day temperatures are the problem, it's really the night temperatures don't drop. Especially some of the states, even Texas, when the summer months, the night temperature does not drop below 80 degrees, the plants are going to a series of stress. So yeah, that's not the best time to plant. But in the Northeast, for example, the night temperatures go back to the 70s. We can plant pretty much all year round. But yeah, some of those southern states, I would be cautious planting. But shaded perennials is a little bit easier to plant because you are in the shade, not in the full sun. So depends on the variety, but I would still recommend holding off. And it is very, very hot, especially if it's like consistently 2-3 weeks the same temperatures and really hot.
Yeah, good tips. So both of you are with breeding companies, and we heard both of you say a few things about some newer varieties and what you're working on. So this is like a two-pronged question. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your focus is on for perennials? Is it disease resistance, longer blooming, et cetera? I know it's all about making the home gardener more successful, happier with what they're getting. So that's part one of the question. And then part two, if both of you can talk about the many different areas throughout the country that you trial perennials in, and how you approach that. Because somebody was saying, well, how are they doing in my area? Or how will I know if they do well in my area? And I'll start with saying that I always say, if your local garden center has it, trust them. They know what's going to do well in their area. So hopefully the garden center in Maryland is not buying the same stuff that the garden center in Southern California is buying, right? And I know that the breeding companies really do a lot of education for the retailers about that. So that's about my knowledge on the topic. I'll turn it over to you guys.
You want to go, Laura, first?
Sure, I can go first. So for the first part of that question on kind of what our breeding goals are, we tend to look for or select for plants that have kind of a more polished habit. A lot of the things that we breed on, such as hibiscus, such as baptisia, even hostas, lots of different things. We're looking to take what on some of the older genetics has been a very large kind of rangy plant habit with maybe, fewer flowers, and taking it down to a much tidier habit, oftentimes something that fits better in kind of an average size yard or garden versus, huge expanses, and also has very good flower coverage. Things like hostas, we have certain traits that we tend to breed for, our breeder tends to select for, such as he really likes to breed for plants that have a lot of like rippling edges to them or arching cascading shapes. So our breeding goals really differ depending on what genus it is, but I'd say kind of a typical one would be for that more polished habit and better flower coverage and longer flower times. And then in terms of trialing, yeah, we have quite an extensive trialing program. I think most of the breeding companies in the United States do as well. We send out plant material to a lot of our customers. We do advanced trialing with some of our really large customers who are located in various parts of the United States. So we have Northeast, we have Southeast, we have Midwest, we have Southwest, we have Pacific Northwest. We have folks everywhere who are trialing our plants for the purpose of of growing and producing them to be able to send to retail customers. We also send plant material to botanic gardens and to university trial gardens, again, throughout the country, you know, Colorado State, Florida State, Penn State, all different places. And we gather data and get feedback from both the grower customers and the gardens on performance and hardiness and all the criteria.
Excellent. Zoltan, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I will start with the trialing process. That's a very important process for us. And when I started with Duman, we had basically no perennial program. So I'm with the company from the beginning. And the trialing process is important for customers. So basically, we our furthest north we trial is 67 miles north of Winnipeg, which is zone 3. It gets 35 to 40 below zero consistently. It gets actually, the ground gets permafrost. And that's our northest charging station. And we go all the way down to southern Florida, Miami. And between every single region, you know, northeast, not only we trial with growers, you know, small, large growers, we also do the university trials, and we try to cover every single climate zone in the entire country, continental US and Canada. And we also do trials in Europe. A lot of countries Europe, because Europe has also different climate, and Europe is not more, you know, not really the most important for this group, but we trial pretty much every single climate zone as possible. On the breeding side, we call it a PMC. It's a product market combination. It really depends on the genre what we're looking for, and for the consumers, for example, there is a better form, better flowering, longer flowering, easier habit, maybe more compact habit, as Laura mentioned. And every single, we call it breeding traits, is defined to the breeder what our goal is, you know. And it's very hard to define something like hosta, because hosta has over 40,000 registered varieties on the board. So there's everything is small, big, flowering, non-flowering, ripple, foliage, straight for the cupping foliage. But if you look at something like, for example, a more simple thing like Laura, the beautiful Aruncus, she's a beautiful native plant, but then you have a lot more compact with a lot more flowers. If you compare to a native Aruncus, it doesn't have half the flower than this plant has. So we try to have a more consumer, it's all for the consumer, really have a better experience. You know, tougher plants, for example, very important. Every general plants don't die as much or doesn't require as much water, more drought tolerant plants, but it's each general has a different, we call it a product market combination. We are really looking for a good, better, and a different as well. So you see sometimes plants which is completely different what's available on the market. And overall, what I have to say is, I give you a good example, which is not a shade plant, but the best plants are on the ward which performs in every single region. Let's say, if you call it as a Dianthus cahori type plant, for example, it performs from northern Canada to southern Florida the same. Those are generally the best plants. And for shade too, hosta performs pretty much, even hostas available in Florida called sun hostas. So hosta is something performed from zone 3 to zone 9. And those are the best plants. And so we're looking at each general and what's on the market and why is it better for the consumer. You know, it's flowers for all season long instead of only 3 weeks. You know, more compact habit, better for small city gardens, better ground cover, things like that. So it's very hard to define what it is.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, you're right. It is, because it's so broad and it is different on each class. And I know with All America Selections, you know, we're doing the same type of thing. We've divided North America up into 6 regions. So we have 3, sometimes 4 different judges in each one of those 6 regions, because we're trying to look to see which ones are going to do best all over. If so, it's a national winner. If it performs better in certain areas, then it's a regional winner. So yeah, it's all something we're doing. Somebody had asked about climate change, and I think I've seen across the board, the drought tolerant, the heat tolerance in breeding is something that everybody is looking at and working towards. So Yeah, I would say our breeding companies are definitely on the leading edge when it comes to paying attention to what's happening across the board. So unfortunately, wow, we have like 3 or 4 minutes left. And so I'm going to now ask you guys to name your 2 favorite perennials for pollinators. So can you each name one for a hummingbird and one for a butterfly, maybe? I think that's really a challenge. I know those are much more sun items, but maybe of some of the ones you've mentioned, can you tell us which ones would be good for hummingbirds and butterflies?
That's a tough question for the shade. So I saw hummingbirds on hosta flowers, but generally I don't see a lot of hummingbirds in the shade. They are more on the sun, but I did see, maybe Laura, you have a better answer, but I don't.
So I would also agree, definitely they will visit hosta flowers. There is a plant, and I didn't include it in the presentation, but it's called Spigelia, and it is a native perennial. We have a couple in production right now at Walters. One of them is called Little Redhead. The other is called Raging Cajun. Little Redhead is very red. Raging Cajun is a little bit more orangey, but they have tubular flowers that are very, very attractive to hummingbirds. And they will grow anywhere from shade to sun, basically. So you're going to have reduced flowering to some degree in the shade than you will in full sun. But that is a plant that you could use in shade to partial shade that will be attractive to hummingbirds. And I think the zone on that plant is 5 to 9. So not for the very, very far north, coldest regions, but definitely for a good part of the country, it'll work.
And Laura, can you spell that?
Spigelia is Spigelia.
Okay, good, great. And then you guys have done so much shade gardening. So why don't we close out with your favorite tip on gardening in the shade? And Laura, you're on my screen, so we can start with you and end with Zoltan. Your favorite gardening tip.
So my favorite tip would probably be to focus, and this is what I like to do in my shade gardening, is to try to focus on just using different textures and foliage colors and kind of mixing it up and really using those, especially lighter colors, brighter colors, yellows, variegated colors, to kind of fill in back in your darkest parts of the shade and really brighten it up, and to mix it in with, greens and yellows and blues and different textures. And like Zoltan said, I too love how you said it looks elegant, because I agree. There's nothing more beautiful than a, gorgeously designed shade garden. So I think that's kind of my favorite thing to do, is to just really mix up the colors and the textures and brighten up the dark spots.
I like to keep the natural look. When you have natural, beautiful shade, and actually I have a beautiful shade area, which I'm designing right now at my house. I try to keep the natural look. Try to use, the natural leaves as compost, and then, mulch and whatnot, but try to keep that natural look. And as I said, if it's a beautiful hosta, heconochlore, and it's more textured, as I mentioned, there are a few flowering perennials in the shade, but it's more of a texture, what Laura mentioned, the golds and the yellow, and that Aurelius, I didn't want to interrupt Laura when that was the first slide. I saw the plants yesterday. That one of the first things actually I'm going to get in my shade garden. It was fantastic. Such a chartreuse yellow, but it also goes with the natural look of shade. And don't try to put too much of a structure in a shade garden. Make it squares and rounds and all that stuff. It's really a natural setting. What I like in shade garden. That's what gives the elegance to the shade garden.
And Mother Nature will love us for doing that. Yeah, putting some beauty in the shade and keeping it natural looking. So, okay, those were excellent tips. And like we talked before, the webinar started, this hour always goes super fast. But what we will do is we've recorded this, we'll turn it into a video. We will send it out to everybody who registered so that they can watch it over and over again for all these nice tips and nice varieties. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody who attended. It was wonderful. It was great information, and we thank you. And I hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you.